Part 1. Greenwood, an American city. Within a city. Tulsa, Oklahoma, is a young city in the early 20th century, ambitious and loud with new money. It is a place that talks about the future as if the future has already been purchased and deeded, and all that remains is to build it. Oil money moves through its streets like a second weather system, unpredictable, enriching, corrosive. Downtown storefronts advertise modernity with plate glass and polished brass. Men in suits speak of opportunity as if it were a natural resource, as if it were extracted from the ground and refined into respectability. And then there is Greenwood. Greenwood is not far from the center of Tulsa, but it is a different jurisdiction in the moral imagination of the city. The boundary is not a wall of stone. It is drawn in habit, reinforced in law, patrolled in glances and tone. People in Greenwood know precisely where they are permitted to walk, where they are expected to lower their eyes, where a wrong turn can turn into a question, and a question can become a punishment. The official language of Tulsa calls this arrangement order. It appears in the city's quiet confidence. Separate entrances, separate schools, separate seating, separate expectations. There is no single document that admits the full nature of it. Instead, there are many smaller ones, ordinances, policies, procedures, each one cleanly typed, each one presented as neutral. In these papers, segregation is treated like plumbing, a technical necessity to prevent the city from backing up. But in the lives lived under it, segregation is not technical, it is intimate. It is a constant instruction about value, a daily rehearsal of humiliation, a forced choreography that never ends. Greenwood develops inside that pressure, not because the pressure is kind, but because the pressure is constant. It draws people together. It compels a private economy. It creates a world that learns to feed itself, educate itself, entertain itself, care for itself, defend itself, because it cannot rely on the larger world to do those things without conditions attached. There is a word that will be used later, Wall Street, and in that phrase there is admiration and mockery at the same time. But before it becomes a headline, Greenwood is simply a neighborhood built by people who are denied ordinary access to wealth and therefore forced into a different method, concentration. The dollars that cannot travel freely outside the district circulate inside it. Businesses grow because there is no alternative. Professionals gather because they have been pushed together. A doctor in Greenwood is not merely a doctor, he is proof that the city's hierarchy is not the natural order it pretends to be. In the morning, Greenwood wakes to the sound of commerce. Streets fill with people walking to work not as servants but as owners, clerks, teachers, barbers, pharmacists, seamstresses. A hotel stands with confidence, Stratford's, in some accounts the largest black-owned hotel in the country, its rooms meant for travelers who cannot assume they will be welcomed elsewhere. There are offices, cafes, pool halls, churches, and meeting rooms where men argue about strategy, and women coordinate mutual aid with the practiced efficiency of those who have never been allowed to be careless. The district's prosperity does not erase hardship, it sits beside it. Many residents work in white Tulsa. Domestic labor, oil fields, rail yards, jobs that pay them enough to survive but not enough to forget. They ride streetcars under watchful eyes. They enter through back doors. They endure the casual cruelties of customers who believe cruelty is their right. They come home carrying a double ledger, the wages they earned and the indignities they swallowed. Greenwood absorbs both. Greenwood turns them into bricks. At night, Greenwood does not go silent. It becomes careful. The lights in certain windows stay on longer than they should, because people are reading, writing, planning. Pastors draft sermons that speak in scripture and in code. Editors consider which truths can be printed without inviting retaliation. Parents rehearse warnings with their children. How to address a white stranger, when to step aside, how to survive an accusation. There is always the sense that prosperity is visible and visibility is dangerous. Official Tulsa rarely describes Greenwood as a place with its own complexity. When it acknowledges Greenwood at all, it does so as a curiosity, an exception to the city's assumed hierarchy, or as a problem. The same prosperity that Greenwood sees as survival, Tulsa can interpret as insolence. The presence of black professionals, of black property, of black confidence creates a psychological disturbance in those who have built their identity around domination. A black man who owns a business is not merely an individual. In the white imagination, he is a violation. And so Greenwood lives with an awareness that its achievements are being watched, not admired, measured. The laws and the records of the era do not record this watching directly. They record its consequences. The courthouse has its routines, arrests, fines, minor disputes, civil paperwork. It is a machinery built to create official truths. In those truths, the city is orderly, problems are isolated, fault is individualized, the system is never indicted. A black man can be charged for stepping out of line, but the line itself is never questioned. For Greenwood residents, the courthouse is not an abstraction. It is a place where lives can be rewritten with a signature. The jail is not merely a holding facility, it is a threat that carries historical memory. Everyone knows the stories of other towns, other nights, other crowds. They know how quickly an accusation can become a rope and how often the law's role is not to prevent that transformation, but to formalize it afterward. This is why Greenwood's prosperity is accompanied by a particular kind of vigilance. It is not paranoia. It is literacy in danger. There are veterans in Greenwood, men who have worn the uniform of the United States in the Great War and returned to find that the uniform does not protect them at home. They have learned discipline and tactics, but also a sharper sense of betrayal. They have seen the state organize violence overseas with bureaucratic efficiency, and they can imagine that same efficiency turning inward. They meet in small groups. They keep their eyes open. They speak carefully, but not softly. There are also people in Greenwood who attempt to believe in incremental progress. They read about court cases in other states. They study political shifts. They attend meetings where strategy is debated, accommodation versus confrontation, quiet diplomacy versus public insistence. This debate is not theoretical. It is a matter of family safety. It is a matter of whether a bold headline tomorrow might mean a broken door tonight. Greenwood's churches stand at the center of this moral atmosphere. They are more than places of worship. They are sanctuaries and bulletin boards, banks of trust, storage rooms for community memory. The language used there is often restrained because restraint is necessary. Yet beneath the restraint runs an unspoken doctrine: we are human, even if the city refuses to behave as if that is true. In the wider city, there is another doctrine spoken in the friendly tones of civic pride. Tulsa is a place where anyone can succeed. It is an official myth designed to erase the conditions of success. It permits the city to celebrate itself while ignoring the architecture of exclusion that makes Greenwood necessary in the first place. When white Tulsa thinks about prosperity, it imagines opportunity. When Greenwood thinks about prosperity, it imagines defense. The tension between these two perceptions is the documentary's first dark fact, and it is present long before the fires. Greenwood exists as a testament that black life can flourish under constraint. Tulsa perceives that testament as a challenge to the very constraint it depends on. The official version of the city's story is written to avoid this contradiction. It prefers to describe Greenwood as separate but peaceful, contained, manageable. But peace is not the same as safety. Peace can be a pause. As May 1921 approaches, there is no siren. There is no single warning that the city is on the edge of mass violence. There is only an accumulation of signs that people trained in danger can read. The way certain newspapers speak about black citizens, the way jokes turn sharper, the way crowds gather more easily, the way the police respond when a white man is angry versus when a black man is afraid. There is the constant background knowledge that in this country prosperity does not immunize black people. It sometimes makes them more visible targets. Greenwood continues anyway. It continues because stopping would not guarantee safety either. It continues because life cannot be lived entirely in anticipation of catastrophe. It continues because there is a stubborn, rational hope embedded in work itself. The belief that building something is a form of testimony, that property and institutions and education can force the world to acknowledge facts it would rather deny. In the official story of Tulsa, Greenwood is a district on a map. In the reality lived inside it, Greenwood is a sustained act of resistance conducted in daylight, under surveillance, with receipts. It is a place that knows the law can be weaponized, that paper can be turned into a trap. And yet it keeps producing paper, deeds, licenses, advertisements, church programs, school records, quiet affirmations that say over and over, we were here. We had names, we had addresses, we had plans for next week. By the end of May, those plans still exist, still intact, still ordinary. The hotel expects guests. The barbers expect customers. Parents expect their children to return from school. People expect, not happiness, but continuity. They do not know how quickly continuity can be revoked by a rumor and a crowd and an official system that will later struggle to admit what it permitted. For now, Greenwood stands in the night, lit in pockets, alive behind its own doors, carrying the weight of its success like a lantern held carefully against the wind. Das Swingi Chungmidiyas Part 2. The Elevator, a Rumor Becomes a Charge. Monday, May 30th, 1921. Tulsa begins the week in the ordinary way that cities begin weeks, with schedules, errands, small debts due, small promises made. Downtown is open for business. Offices fill. Men lean into their routines as if routine itself is protection against disorder. Near South Main Street, the Drexel Building stands in the confident geometry of a growing city, an office building with tenants above and commerce below. It is not the kind of place where history is expected to happen. It is meant for clerks, for paperwork, for the daily movement of people and documents, a place of floors and elevators, and the quiet, mechanical trust that when you step inside a cage of iron and cables, it will lift you without asking who you are. Dick Rowland is in that district that morning. Officially, he is recorded as a black youth, a shoe shiner, a minor worker in a city where black labor is everywhere and black autonomy is constantly negotiated. He is not, on paper, a man of consequence. He is a name that will later become a hinge. He moves through downtown with the practiced awareness of someone who knows the risks of proximity. In Tulsa, in 1921, there are places a black boy can stand and be ignored, and places he can stand and be read as an offense. Inside the Drexel Building, Sarah Page operates the elevator. She is white, young, and employed in a position that places her at a point of contact. She opens and closes the gate. She carries people upward. She stands at the narrow intersection of bodies in close quarters. Her name, too, will become a hinge, spoken by others more than by herself, printed in forms and headlines, turned into a symbol, then largely removed from public view as if the story can continue without her consent. What happens in the elevator is the first fault line in the file. The official record that emerges later will be confident in its implications and vague in its specifics. A scream is reported. A clerk or witness on a lower floor claims to have seen something, enough to call the police, enough to describe Rowland's flight from the building as evidence of guilt. The word assault begins to float into the air with no need for detail because in that era, it is a word with a built-in outcome. It does not describe a fact so much as it initiates a process. The reality, in the accounts that survive outside the immediate machinery of accusation, is less neat. There are versions in which Rowland stumbles, versions in which the elevator jolts or he trips near the threshold, and in the reflex of falling, he grabs at the nearest arm. The scream, in that telling, belongs to surprise, not to violence. But surprise does not travel through Tulsa in neutral language. Surprise becomes narrative. Narrative becomes charge. By the end of May 30th, the incident has moved from a private space into a public one. It has entered the city's bloodstream. Talk in storefronts, talk at street corners, talk that sharpens as it spreads. This is how certain events begin in America, without a verdict, without investigation, without patience. A rumor does not need to be proven to be operational. It only needs to be believable to the people who want to believe it. The next morning, Tuesday, May 31st, Rowland is taken into custody. The official action is simple. A black youth arrested, held at the Tulsa County Courthouse. The act of arrest, in official language, is not supposed to be an alarm. It is supposed to be the beginning of due process. A person is accused. The courts decide. The city remains calm. But Greenwood hears the arrest differently. Greenwood has a long education in what the legal process can become when it is paired with a white crowd. In 1921, protective custody is not a comforting phrase. Jail does not mean safe. The courthouse is not merely an institution. It is a stage where the law sometimes performs its neutrality while surrendering its power behind the curtain. Greenwood residents have seen and heard what happens in other towns when a black man is accused and a mob gathers for justice. They know how quickly the language of order can turn into the language of spectacle. Then the newspaper arrives. Tulsa has an afternoon paper, and that Tuesday, it prints a story that does not merely report an arrest. It gives the rumor a formal shape. A headline appears with the hard certainty of print, accusing Rowland of attacking the elevator operator. It is a public statement delivered as fact. It describes a white girl as a victim and a black youth as a predator. It does not need to say lynch to activate the city's appetite for it. In the archive of the event, that article is a blunt instrument, an accusation typeset and distributed, ready to be repeated. And yet even the paper trail contains its own damage. In later preserved records, pieces of that edition are missing, torn away, absent in ways that feel less like accident than like decision. The file itself has been handled, altered, curated. A headline can be reconstructed, a paragraph can be recalled, but the physical evidence is incomplete, as if the city, later, when it has time to consider consequence, tries to remove the fuse after the explosion. The absence becomes part of the evidence. When paper is missing, the missing paper speaks. There are also references, repeated in later accounts, to an editorial that circulated that day, said to have carried a title that is almost too explicit to believe, and yet entirely consistent with the era's public brutality, a call for lynching, framed not as a crime, but as a civic act. Whether the exact text survives is less important than what matters immediately in Tulsa on May 31st. People behave as if such a call has been issued. The city's mood shifts from rumor to intention. By late afternoon, the courthouse becomes a gathering point. Men arrive in twos and threes, then in dozens, then in hundreds. The crowd grows the way crowds grow when they are allowed to. Each new arrival reads the presence of others as validation. People come not only to see what will happen, but to influence what happens, to apply weight to the decision-making of the state. This is one of the oldest tensions in American public life, the relationship between official authority and popular violence. The law says it controls the process. The crowd tests that claim. Inside the courthouse, officials make statements that will later appear in the language of restraint. The sheriff refuses to surrender Roland. Deputies prepare to defend the jail. Doors are secured. Windows watched. The state, at least in that moment, behaves as if it intends to hold the line between accusation and execution. Outside, the crowd behaves as if the state's role is to deliver the accused to them. And Greenwood hears it all. The news travels north across the tracks as fast as voices can carry it. In Greenwood, men read the afternoon paper and understand that the paper is not only describing an incident, it is assigning roles. It is telling white Tulsa what to feel and what to demand. It is telling Greenwood what to fear. The fear is not abstract. It has a specific shape. A black youth pulled from custody, beaten, hanged, burned, photographed, then forgotten by the courts. Greenwood residents do not need to invent this image. American archives are full of it, even when they pretend not to be. The country has a habit of recording Black death as souvenir and refusing to record Black life as evidence. So Greenwood begins to respond. There are men who talk first in the careful language of caution. Stay home. Do not provoke. Do not go downtown. Do not add fuel to the fire. There are others, especially veterans, who talk in a different language. Protection, duty, prevention. They understand that the courthouse is not an abstract institution. It is a physical place, and physical places can be defended. By early evening on May 31st, Tulsa has split into two competing understandings of the same event. The official version insists that the system is functioning. An accused person in custody, authorities in control, due process pending. It is the language of the courthouse, the language of procedure, the language that pretends time will be allowed to do its work. The lived reality in Greenwood insists on a different truth. That procedure can be overwhelmed, that custody can be breached, that the law can be bent by the same hands that claim to uphold it. They look at the crowd and do not see concerned citizens. They see a mechanism. They see history repeating itself with new names. The air around the courthouse grows heavier. The city's paper has spoken. The crowd has gathered. The accused sits inside the building as a symbol more than as a person, his body, his fear, his silence barely relevant to the public drama being assembled around him. His name is being used as a lever to move a community. The case file at this point is still thin. An elevator, a scream, an arrest, a headline, a gathering crowd. Nothing yet has burned. Nothing yet has been formally declared. But the city is already moving. The rumor has become a charge. And the charge has become permission. Permission for people to imagine violence as justice, and for institutions to discover how fragile their authority becomes when the crowd decides it has the right to enforce its own verdict. Night is coming, and with night, Tulsa's most decisive question will be asked not in a courtroom, but on the courthouse steps. Who holds power when the law is tested? Paper, or men with guns, or those who have learned through bitter repetition that silence is not safety? Part 3. The courthouse steps. Protection interpreted as threat. The courthouse in Tulsa is an instrument of authority built in stone and routine. It is meant to be the city's spine, a place where disputes become paperwork, where violence is transmuted into charges, where the state claims the exclusive right to decide what happens next. On the evening of May 31, 1921, that claim is no longer theoretical. It is tested in public, in full view, under a sky that is darkening with summer heat. Outside, the crowd thickens. Men arrive from offices, from shops, from oil fields. Some come out of curiosity, some out of anger, some because the mood itself is contagious and they do not want to be absent from what they sense will become history. They gather with the confidence of a majority that has rarely been refused. Their talk is not procedural, it is possessive. They speak of their town, their women, their justice, as if the courthouse is not a barrier but a distribution point. Inside, Dick Rowland waits. He is not present in the public imagination as a human being. He is a rumor condensed into a body. He is a young man with fear in his stomach, listening to sounds that do not belong in a courthouse. The murmur of a crowd that wants him dead, the occasional hard crack of shouted laughter, the shifting footsteps of deputies who understand that doors can be broken. The official posture of the sheriff is recorded later as firm. Willard McCulloch refuses to hand Rowland over. His men are posted with weapons. There are reports of preparations, barricades, watch positions, guarded stairwells, practical measures that become, in hindsight, the first evidence that officials recognize the likelihood of a lynching attempt. The sheriff's refusal is an act of legal integrity, but it is also an act of self-preservation. If the mob takes a prisoner from his jail, the state is publicly humiliated. The badge becomes ornamental. The crowd reads the refusal not as law, but as insult. By late evening, the courthouse steps become a pressure point. Every minute that passes without surrender is interpreted as defiance. The crowd's demands are not articulated as requests. They are issued as expectations. Men begin to shift from gathering to organizing. Someone points out the windows. Someone suggests the back entrance. Someone says that if the sheriff will not deliver the accused, the crowd will take him. In this atmosphere, the difference between talk and action is only the first man willing to move. Greenwood, watching from the north side of the city, understands this threshold. The news reaches them in fragments. Someone saw the crowd, someone heard the talk, someone read the paper, someone knows how these things end. In Greenwood, the memory of lynching is not a story from distant states. It is a national pattern that repeats wherever the state allows it, and Greenwood has reason to believe the state will allow it. The evidence is not only historical, it is immediate, in the posture of white Tulsa itself. A crowd does not gather like this unless it assumes it can. The first group of black men who go downtown that night do not go as a mob. They go with purpose and restraint. Many are veterans. They have carried rifles for a country that does not treat them as citizens. They have learned, through military service, that disciplined presence can deter violence. They also know that disciplined presence can be misread as provocation by those who fear any form of black agency. They arrive at the courthouse in a small number, perhaps 24 at first in some accounts. They ask to see the sheriff. Their request is direct. They are there to help protect the prisoner, to prevent a lynching, to support the law's claim that custody means something. This is the logic of citizenship. If the state cannot defend its own due process, citizens step forward. But in Tulsa, that logic is unstable. The very act of black men arriving armed, even with the intent to defend the state's procedures, creates a contradiction the city cannot tolerate. In the eyes of the white crowd, black men with guns are not protectors of order. They are an uprising. Their presence is interpreted as an attempted reversal of hierarchy, a public assertion that black people can claim space and authority. It does not matter what they say their purpose is. Their purpose is overwritten by what others need them to represent. This is how a protective act becomes a threat. The sheriff speaks with them. He declines their offer, or tells them he has the situation under control. The men return to Greenwood. They leave with discipline, not with theatrics. But they have seen the crowd, and they have felt the mood. They have learned something that cannot be unlearned. The line between the courthouse and the mob is thin, and it is held by men who may not be willing or able to hold it. The white crowd absorbs the encounter differently. It takes the very fact of black presence as evidence that danger is coming from Greenwood, not toward it. The rumor of the elevator incident now acquires a second rumor, that black men are planning to seize the prisoner, that Greenwood is mobilizing, that something must be done before it happens. In this way, the situation escalates by narrative rather than by fact. The crowd manufactures justification in real time. Later that evening, a second group from Greenwood arrives, larger than the first. They come for the same reason. The first attempt did not end the danger, and the danger is growing. They are not children. They are men with families and businesses and church obligations. They are men who know what lynching means in the language of bodies, not headlines. They come because waiting at home does not feel like safety. It feels like complicity in their own helplessness. Again, their arrival is read by the white crowd as aggression. The courthouse steps fill with charged geometry, white men clustered in mass, armed in many cases though not uniformly. Black men arranged with more visible discipline because discipline is how they have been trained to survive scrutiny. Deputies stand between them with the uneasy posture of men who understand they are outnumbered in spirit if not in weapons. The courthouse, meant to be neutral ground, becomes a contested terrain. It is not a courtroom, but it carries the same question as any trial. Whose story will be believed, and whose force will be permitted? Someone demands that the black men be disarmed. The demand is framed as common sense, even though many in the white crowd are armed as well. The asymmetry is not hidden, it is the point. The crowd wants not only control, but symbolic control. A black man with a gun is treated as a scandal. A white man with a gun is treated as a right. A confrontation begins not with a grand speech, but with a small, physical movement. A white man steps toward a black veteran and reaches for his weapon. There is a moment of stillness, the kind that arrives when everyone senses the threshold. Words are exchanged, urgent and sharp. The veteran resists. The crowd surges forward in instinctive motion as if the demand to disarm has always been waiting for an excuse to become force. A shot is fired. In the later file, this shot becomes contested. Different witnesses assign it to different hands. Some say the black men fired first. Others say the white crowd did. The exact origin is less important than what follows. Once the first shot exists, everyone can claim self-defense. Violence gains paperwork in advance, a justification that can be repeated later with a clean conscience. The courthouse steps collapse into chaos. Gunfire ripples outward. Men run. Some fall. The crowd that had gathered expecting to watch a lynching now becomes a battlefield it did not anticipate, and it reacts not with reflection, but with rage. The presence of black armed men, originally intended as deterrence, now serves, in the white imagination, as proof that Greenwood is hostile. The rumor of an elevator incident expands into a larger myth, that black Tulsa has risen, that white Tulsa is under attack, that a lesson must be delivered. The black men retreat. They do not charge into the crowd. They pull back toward Greenwood, toward their homes, toward the district that has become both their refuge and their target. The retreat is tactical, but it is also psychological, a recognition that they have stepped onto ground designed for their loss. Downtown Tulsa is not a neutral space. It is a space where any black assertion can be punished as rebellion. As the black men move north, some are pursued. The streets that had carried everyday traffic now carry armed groups. The night changes character. It becomes a hunt. The violence does not remain localized at the courthouse. It begins to spread across the city like ink released into water, turning everything it touches darker. Inside the courthouse, officials will later say they tried to maintain control. They will point to their refusal to hand over Roland. They will point to their attempts to disperse the crowd. They will point to the fact that the prisoner remained alive through the night, as if that fact is the measure of success. But the reality experienced by Greenwood is not measured by whether one prisoner survives. It is measured by what the city has now permitted. A white crowd armed and mobilized, already primed to interpret Greenwood's existence as provocation. The courthouse confrontation has provided the spark, and more importantly, the justification. The city can now call what is coming a riot, a mutual fight, an unfortunate clash, rather than what it will be, an invasion enabled by the language of self-defense. By midnight, the courthouse is no longer the center of the story. It is merely the first scene in a larger file. The question is no longer whether Dick Rowland will be lynched. The question has expanded, in the worst way, to something broader and more destructive. Whether Greenwood itself will be punished for the crime of refusing to stand still while a lynching was assembled in public. And in Tulsa, once that question is asked, the answers tend to be delivered not by judges, but by crowds. Part 4. Night falls. Deputization and the licensing of violence. After the first shots on the courthouse steps, Tulsa does not return to order. It reorganizes its disorder. The city's violence does not appear as a sudden madness. It takes on structure. It finds hierarchy. It acquires, in places, the appearance of official permission. This is what makes the night so dangerous. It is not merely a crowd unbound. It is a crowd that begins to feel authorized. In the hours after midnight, men move through downtown with weapons no longer hidden. They gather in small clusters that resemble patrols. Some are familiar faces, store owners, clerks, laborers, men who, earlier in the day, might have spoken politely to a neighbor. Now they carry rifles and pistols, and they speak with the confidence of those who believe their actions will not be punished. This confidence does not come from nowhere. It comes from the city's long training in racial hierarchy. It comes from the silence of institutions. And it comes, in the most concrete sense, from badges and words handed out too easily. The word deputized begins to circulate. It sounds technical, it sounds legal, it implies a process, a chain of command, a restraint. But in practice, it can be nothing more than a brief transaction. A white man presents himself as willing, and an official, pressed by fear, anger, or convenience, gives him a symbol of authority. A badge turns private violence into public duty. It is not a transformation of character. It is a transformation of accountability. There are reasons that officials will later give for this improvised enlargement of force. They will say the city faced unrest, that they needed manpower, that they were trying to protect property and lives. These explanations sit neatly in the official record because they sound like governance. But in the lived experience of Greenwood, deputization is not governance. It is the distribution of permission to the people most eager to use it. When authority is handed to a crowd, the crowd does not become disciplined. The authority becomes a mask. By early morning, armed groups begin to move north and east. The direction is not accidental. It is drawn by the city's racial map. Greenwood lies across the tracks, and the tracks are not only a physical boundary, they are a psychological one. On one side, white Tulsa, with its civic certainty. On the other, black Tulsa, with its guarded prosperity. The city has always understood that boundary. Now, in the dark, men approach it as a line to be crossed. The official language that will later be applied to these movements is evasive. It prefers phrases like mobilization, response, containment. It suggests that the armed white men are reacting to a threat. But what threat is being contained? The shots at the courthouse did not come from an army. They came from a small group of men trying to prevent a lynching. Their retreat should have ended the confrontation. Instead, their retreat becomes a story that white Tulsa tells itself, that Greenwood is dangerous, that Greenwood has declared war, that Greenwood must be disarmed. In this story, white Tulsa is always defending itself. Greenwood does not have the luxury of storytelling. It has a more urgent language, preparation. Men gather to discuss what they have seen and what they expect. Some bring weapons, others bring lists of families who need help, children who must be moved, elders who must not be left alone. The churches and meeting halls become points of coordination, the way they always have in moments when official protection is uncertain. There is no single command center. Greenwood is not a state, it is a community. Its power comes from relationships, not from institutions designed to enforce. This, too, is part of the imbalance. White Tulsa can transform civilians into agents with badges. Greenwood cannot transform its community into an officially recognized defense. Any organized black self-protection is labeled insurgency. Any organized white aggression is labeled order. As dawn approaches, the night deepens into a particular kind of operational clarity. Men in white Tulsa begin to take positions on the edges of Greenwood. There are reports of shots fired into the district. The first deaths of this phase of violence are often quiet, individual people caught in the open, a man returning from work, a family peering from a doorway, a figure moving too slowly under the wrong street lamp. These incidents will later be hard to trace in the archive because they are not the kind of deaths the system is eager to count. They are not deaths that generate neat paperwork. They are deaths that occur in the gaps between institutions where responsibility can be scattered. When violence begins, it begins in fragments. But the fragments multiply. The state's presence is ambiguous. There are lawmen in the streets, but their role is inconsistent. Some attempt to restrain the crowd, others are absorbed into it. The badge, in this atmosphere, does not guarantee protection. It can signal danger depending on who wears it and what they believe their authority means. Greenwood residents learn quickly that uniform is not a reliable indicator of safety. The official symbol can function as cover for unofficial intention. There are moments when Greenwood residents go to officials and ask for protection, for intervention, for enforcement of the very laws the city claims to uphold. The responses, when they come, are often delayed, bureaucratic, or framed as impossible under the circumstances. The system behaves as if it is overwhelmed, even when the violence is moving along lines that are predictable. It is overwhelmed in the way a person can be overwhelmed while still choosing which emergencies to prioritize. The moral tension of the night is not simply that people are violent. It is that violence is being organized and normalized. As the city turns toward morning, the story becomes easier for white Tulsa to tell itself. It is no longer a courthouse confrontation. It is now, in the language of rumor and convenience, a Negro uprising. Those words do not describe reality. They manufacture permission. They allow white men to imagine themselves as soldiers, to imagine their weapons as necessary, to imagine their fear as heroic. A lie becomes a uniform. The phrase special deputy becomes a kind of passport. With it, men can stop cars, seize weapons, detain black residents, and declare their actions lawful. In practice, this means that Greenwood residents can be disarmed not by a court order, but by a stranger holding a badge and a gun. It means that the violence is not only physical, it is administrative. It is the conversion of racial domination into procedure. In Greenwood, the fear becomes layered. There is fear of gunfire, fear of fire, fear of looting. But beneath these is a deeper fear, the fear that there will be no legal boundary to what is about to happen. That the violence will not be treated as a crime but as a correction. That any attempt to resist will be used as proof that the correction was necessary. This fear is not irrational. It is based on precedent and on the way the night is unfolding. Greenwood can hear the city's machinery adjusting itself, not to stop what is coming, but to justify it. The early hours bring new reports. White men breaking into hardware stores for ammunition. Groups gathering around automobiles. Men drinking. Men boasting. Men making plans. The violence is not only spontaneous, it is logistical. People coordinate routes. They identify targets. They speak of Greenwood's businesses not as human livelihoods but as prizes, property to be taken or destroyed. And within this atmosphere, a final and ominous shift occurs. The boundary between property protection and property destruction collapses. The city's stated rationale, protecting Tulsa, does not match the behavior on the ground. Men do not simply aim to arrest or disarm, they aim to burn and erase. The logic moves from control to annihilation. By morning, the city is poised at a terrible threshold. The deputized patrols, the armed crowds, the rumors turned into doctrine. These have created a kind of unofficial mandate. The violence has been given a vocabulary of legitimacy. It has been dressed in the language of law. From the outside, the coming day might still look like a civic crisis. From inside Greenwood, it already feels like something more final. A moment when the city has decided that black prosperity is not merely inconvenient but intolerable, and that the systems meant to restrain violence can be repurposed to sponsor it. When daylight arrives, it will not bring clarity. It will only make visible what the night has already set in motion, a coordinated attack moving across a boundary that Tulsa has always maintained, now not to separate communities, but to deliver punishment. And because it carries badges, it will later be argued as order. Daswingi Trung 29's Part 5. The Invasion of Greenwood, Fire as a Policy. Just before dawn on Wednesday, June 1, 1921, Tulsa crosses a line it will spend generations arguing about, not because the line is hard to see, but because it is hard to confess. The night's confusion at the courthouse has already been translated into a simpler story for public use. The city is under threat, law and order are at risk, extraordinary measures are required. This is the official frame taking shape while the sky is still dim, while the streets are still cool enough to carry footsteps without dust. In Greenwood, the hours before sunrise are not framed as civic crisis. They are lived as a siege. Men who have slept in their clothes listen for movement beyond the tracks. Women count children in whispered numbers, not as a ritual, but as a method of staying sane. There is no siren that tells them the attack has begun. The beginning arrives in pieces. A crack of gunfire somewhere too close. The rapid steps of someone running. The metallic sound of a door struck by a rifle butt. The sudden brightness of a window that should not be bright. When daylight comes, the violence becomes legible. Not lawful, legible. From the south and west edges of Greenwood, armed white groups press forward in widening lines. In later accounts, there will be talk of a signal, something like a whistle, followed by a surge that looks less like a riot and more like a planned advance. The official version will hesitate to admit planning because planning implies intent, and intent implies responsibility. A riot can be called spontaneous. A coordinated movement cannot. Yet people in Greenwood will remember the way the attackers moved, not merely firing, but advancing street by street, pushing residents northward, concentrating them into fewer and fewer exits. The first acts are not only shooting, they are disarming, detaining, isolating. Black men are stopped and searched, weapons are taken, some are marched away under guard. The paper logic of it is simple: control the ability to resist, then control the bodies. Official language later calls this restoring order. In Greenwood's reality, it feels like the state has decided that the only disorder worth addressing is black survival. Then the destruction becomes unmistakable: fire. Greenwood has been built in wood and brick, in the mixed architecture of a community that has had to expand quickly and improvise. It is vulnerable to flame, and the attackers treat that vulnerability not as collateral risk, but as strategy. Buildings are entered and emptied, goods are carried out. Then, in many places, something is lit: matches, oil, torches, whatever is at hand, and the district begins to burn in multiple points at once, as if the intention is not merely to punish individuals, but to erase the infrastructure of black life. This is where the distinction between the official version and the lived reality becomes a moral break. The official vocabulary will later drift toward terms that blur agency. Fires broke out. Buildings were damaged. The district was destroyed in the unrest. These phrases behave like fog. They obscure hands. They conceal decisions. They hide the fact that fire requires ignition, and that ignition, repeated across blocks, implies purpose. In Greenwood, fire is not a metaphor. It is heat on the face and smoke in the throat. It is the sound of glass failing, the sudden collapse of a roof, the frantic calculation of which object to carry when every object is proof of a life. It is a mother deciding whether to run with bedding or to run with papers, birth certificates, deeds, photographs, because she understands, in a way the courthouse rarely does, that the loss of paper can be a second death. Fire does not only destroy property, it destroys the evidence that property belonged to you. As the morning advances, the district's landmarks become targets. A hotel that once stood as a statement of dignity is entered, looted, and left to flame. Offices that held ledgers and contracts, documents that prove transactions, ownership, the legitimacy of enterprise, are scattered, burned, made weightless. Churches that carried the community's record of baptisms, marriages, funerals, and meetings become vulnerable not only as buildings but as archives. When a sanctuary burns, the city loses more than wood and plaster. It loses registers, signatures, names written in careful ink that can never be rewritten exactly the same way. People flee in streams, across backyards, down alleys, through streets now filled with smoke and shouting. Some run toward the outskirts of Tulsa. Some are forced into detention points. Some hide, not because hiding is safe, but because movement draws attention, and attention brings the rifle's aim. The most terrifying aspect of the morning is how quickly normal identity becomes dangerous. A man is not targeted for what he has done. He is targeted for what he is. A woman is not spared because she is unarmed. She is vulnerable because the rules of restraint are not being applied to her at all. Above the streets, another contested layer enters the file: airplanes. Survivors will speak for decades about low-flying aircraft circling over Greenwood, about shots from above, about objects dropped, about the unnerving sense that the attack was not only horizontal but vertical, as if the sky itself had been conscripted. The official record will often treat these accounts with caution, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with silence, because acknowledging aircraft implies resources and coordination that the riot narrative cannot accommodate. Yet the testimonies persist, not as legend, but as memory that refuses to disappear simply because it complicates the city's preferred story. On the ground, the destruction spreads until it becomes geography. Block after block is consumed: businesses, homes, schools, places of entertainment, places of care, until Greenwood is no longer a neighborhood in the ordinary sense but a burning grid. Later estimates will describe more than 1,000 homes and buildings destroyed, tens of blocks reduced to char and foundations, thousands of people suddenly homeless. In the official version, these become numbers that can be debated. In Greenwood's lived reality, these are doors that will never open again, beds that will never be slept in again, kitchens that will never be used again. There is also a quieter violence that runs alongside the flames: theft. When a community is under assault, looting is not merely opportunism, It is a statement about entitlement. Men enter homes and take what they want, clothing, jewelry, money, furniture, because the act of taking is part of the punishment. It communicates not only that Greenwood can be destroyed, but that Greenwood can be harvested. In later legal language, these losses will be hard to categorize. Fire claims can be denied, stolen property can be shrugged off. The archive struggles to hold theft because theft requires identifying thieves, and the city is not eager to identify itself. As the morning moves toward midday, the official machinery begins to reassert itself, not first as justice, but as control. National Guard troops arrive in force and martial law is declared before noon. The phrasing sounds like intervention. The reality, for Greenwood residents, is more complex. Yes, the mass violence begins to subside under organized military presence, but the same apparatus also participates in rounding up black survivors, moving them into detention sites, requiring identification and permission to leave, turning the victims of the attack into the managed population. Even relief is administered through restriction. By the time the fires diminish, Greenwood is no longer a community operating within segregation. It is a field of remains. The official version, already preparing its paperwork, will lean on a single word to absorb the city's responsibility: riot. A riot is chaotic. A riot is mutual. A riot is something that happened, not something that was done. In that word is the first draft of denial, the first legal posture, the first insurance strategy, the first attempt to separate violence from decision-making. But Greenwood's reality does not fit the word. Greenwood's reality is a district attacked at its edges, pushed inward, disarmed, looted, and burned in a pattern that looks less like a sudden accident and more like a policy executed by a crowd that had been given the confidence of impunity. When the smoke lifts enough for people to see, they see foundations where buildings stood. They see chimneys standing like thin monuments to rooms that no longer exist. They see paper ash swirling in the streets, pieces of letters, receipts, photographs, business records, each fragment a torn page from lives that had been documented, once, in careful ink. And in the middle of this, there is a final, quiet horror. The sense that the city will argue about names and numbers, about terminology and blame, while the survivors are already being forced into the next task: finding shelter, finding family, finding proof that they ever owned anything at all. The fire has done what it was meant to do. It has not only destroyed Greenwood's structures, it has attempted to destroy Greenwood's ability to prove, in the language the law respects, that Greenwood existed. Part 6. Detention and Control. The camps after the flames. When the last bright tongues of fire begin to shorten, Tulsa does not return Greenwood to its people. It gathers Greenwood's people instead. In the hours after June 1, 1921, the city's violence changes its shape. The gunfire thins, the burning slows, and in the space where open destruction recedes, a different machinery takes over, one that speaks in the language of protection, order, and procedure. The official story begins to pivot. The worst is over, authorities have intervened, stability is being restored. But for the survivors, the worst does not end when the flames stop. It mutates. It becomes administrative. They emerge from hiding places, under beds, in cellars, behind fences, in the shallow cover of smoke, and they step into a city that treats them as a population to be processed. Men, women, and children are directed at gunpoint, herded into lines, marched away from their own streets. They are not asked what they have lost. They are instructed where to go. The act is presented as humane necessity, for their safety, for public order, to prevent further violence. In lived reality, it feels like captivity with cleaner words. Convention Hall becomes one of the first destinations, a building meant for civic gatherings now repurposed into a holding site. The fairgrounds become another. Other improvised points appear, spaces that can hold bodies, count bodies, control bodies. The city's official posture is that these places are shelters, that the survivors are being protected from the chaos. The truth experienced inside them is simpler. They are camps, and the survivors are not free. At entry points, there are checks. Names are taken, or misheard, or not recorded at all. People are asked to identify themselves to the same authority that failed to protect them. Some are tagged or issued passes. The symbolism is quiet but unmistakable. After an attack that has stripped them of homes and property, they are now reduced to paperwork. A person becomes an entry in a list. A family becomes a problem of logistics. In the official version, this is rational governance. A crisis requires coordination. In the survivor's reality, it is an inversion that cuts into the nerves. They are the wounded, yet they are treated as suspects. They are the displaced, yet they are managed as if they are the source of instability. The city claims to be preventing further violence, but the restrictions fall most heavily on those who have already been harmed. For many, the first night in detention is a lesson in how control operates without needing to raise its voice. People sleep on floors. They share blankets when there are any. They search for relatives in crowds that feel endless. A child cries and is hushed not only because of exhaustion, but because sound draws attention, and attention has become dangerous. Mothers stand in lines to ask whether their husbands have been taken elsewhere. Men scan faces for the missing. Some discover, in whispers, that neighbors were shot during the flight and never arrived at the camps at all. There is no formal announcement that explains the rules. The rules are learned through consequences. You may not leave without permission. You may not return to Greenwood freely. You may not move through the city as you did before. In some places, a white employer must come to claim you. An arrangement described as verification, as sponsorship, as an orderly process to ensure that people are not wandering unsafely. But in lived reality, it carries a darker echo. The requirement that a white person vouch for a black person's right to move, as if freedom itself has become conditional and rented. The city frames this as temporary. Temporary becomes elastic in a crisis. It stretches. It becomes the default condition until someone powerful decides it should end. And so the survivors learn that even after their homes are destroyed, they must negotiate with the same hierarchy that existed before the fire, only now with fewer resources and greater dependence. A woman who once ran a business now stands behind a rope line waiting to be recognized by a white employer, not because she has become less capable, but because the city has rearranged her options. The destruction of Greenwood has not only burned property, it has burned bargaining power. In the camps, the psychological tension sharpens into a quiet humiliation. Being watched while grieving. Guards walk the aisles. Orders are given. Movement is monitored. These measures can be presented as necessary in any emergency, but the survivor's experience is colored by the context. The emergency was not a flood, not a storm, not an accident. It was human violence directed at them, and the system's first sustained, organized interaction with them after that violence is not restitution. It is containment. Some officials will later insist that they acted to prevent further bloodshed. In a narrow sense, the arrival of organized military authority does reduce the open attacks. The city's chaos is curbed, but the moral problem remains. The curbing happens after the destruction, and the curbing is paired with a reassertion of racial control that treats Greenwood's population as a managed risk rather than as citizens who have been assaulted. Meanwhile, outside the camps, Greenwood lies open. The district, burned and broken, becomes accessible to those who wish to pick through it. What remains of homes and shops, half-collapsed walls, exposed foundations, scattered possessions, sits vulnerable. Survivors are not allowed to return freely to secure what little is left. The official explanation is safety. The area is dangerous, unstable, still smoldering. But the consequence is clear. The survivors' separation from their own property allows the city to decide what orderly cleanup looks like, what salvage is permitted, what is simply taken. In any case file, this separation matters. It shapes what evidence survives. A business ledger left on a desk becomes ash. A deed stored in a drawer becomes pulp in the rain. Photographs become mud. Objects that could later prove lost become indistinguishable from debris. And without proof, the next stage of the story, insurance, court claims, compensation, begins already wounded. Inside the camps, aid arrives in uneven waves: food, clothing, medical attention, sometimes provided by relief organizations or local efforts. The presence of aid can be used to decorate the official narrative. Tulsa helped. Tulsa responded. Tulsa cared for the displaced. For survivors, aid is not an absolution. It is necessity. It does not erase the memory of how quickly the city turned against them. It does not replace the homes. It does not restore the dead. It does not return stolen wealth or lost paper. And even aid can carry control. Distribution lines, eligibility rules, documentation, overseers. The survivor receives a blanket and understands that the blanket is not freedom. The camps become a place where the official story is rehearsed and the lived story is suppressed. People speak carefully because they do not know which words will be punished. They do not know whether complaining will jeopardize the past that allows them to leave. They do not know whether naming a perpetrator, if they even can, will result in retaliation later, when the guards are gone and the city returns to its ordinary rhythms of power. Fear becomes strategic silence. Children absorb the lesson without being taught, that the city can set you on fire and then ask for your name. In the days that follow, the city begins to formalize its posture. Declarations are made. Boundaries are imposed. The rhetoric of public safety persists, and in it the city can hide its moral failure. If survivors are kept behind ropes and under guard, it can be framed as a measure to protect them from further harm. Yet the deeper function is also clear: to prevent Greenwood from acting as an organized collective in the immediate aftermath, to keep its people scattered and dependent, to ensure that reconstruction, if it happens at all, will occur on terms dictated by others. And the survivors begin to sense what comes next. Not just grief, not just rebuilding, but the second battle, the battle over narrative and legality, over whether this will be recorded as an atrocity done to them or as a disturbance caused by them, over whether the city will treat their losses as crimes committed against citizens or as unfortunate outcomes of unrest. In that coming battle, paper will matter. Lists of detainees, passes, official statements, the language chosen by authorities, the terms printed in newspapers. But even before the courts convene, the camps have already written their own argument in practice. They declare, without saying it aloud, that Greenwood's people are not being returned to their lives. They are being reorganized into a controlled population, temporarily tolerated, permanently marked. In the official version, these are relief centers. In the reality felt by those inside, they are the quiet continuation of the attack, less visible than fire, less dramatic than gunfire, but equally instructive about where power lives and how easily that power can translate fear into procedure. Part 7. Counting the dead. Missing certificates, quiet graves, contested numbers. After the fires, Tulsa becomes a city of arguments. Not arguments in the street, those have already been answered with bullets and flame, but arguments in the safer rooms where power prefers to operate. Offices, council chambers, editorial desks, court corridors. The language changes. It becomes careful. It becomes technical. It becomes a way of stepping around the most direct question. How many people died? The official version of the question treats it as a matter of record-keeping. It assumes that death is a countable event, a number that can be reached through orderly methods: a coroner's report, a death certificate, a burial permit, a hospital ledger. In the official imagination, the dead are known because the state knows them. Their bodies pass through systems that leave paper behind. But Greenwood's reality does not align with that assumption. Bodies do not always enter the systems that are designed to acknowledge them. Sometimes the system's first instinct is to move bodies out of sight before they create obligations. Sometimes the system's second instinct is to reduce the count so the city can reduce the shame. Sometimes the system's third instinct is to leave the count uncertain because uncertainty protects more people than accuracy ever will. In the days following June 1st, the physical landscape of Greenwood is still smoking, but the administrative landscape has already begun to clean itself. Officials speak of restoration and relief. They discuss property damage and public order. They negotiate over terminology. They begin to prepare the civic narrative in which the city acted decisively, the crisis ended, and the matter can be filed away. The dead complicate that narrative. The dead are an indictment that cannot be explained by bad weather or accident. If the numbers are high, the city's claims of a mere riot become less plausible. If the numbers are high, the question becomes unavoidable. Who killed them, where, and under what authority? If the numbers are high, then the violence is not a moment of chaos but a mass event with organization, participants, and consequences. So the official count, where it is offered, tends toward modesty. It tends toward a figure that can be mourned without demanding justice. In Greenwood, survivors speak in a different register. They speak of neighbors who never returned from the streets. They speak of men seen bleeding at the edge of the district, carried away by others whose names they never learned. They speak of gunshots in the night and the sudden absence of familiar faces in the camps. They speak of the smell that lingers after smoke has thinned, something heavier, something not entirely explained by burned wood. Their numbers are not neat because their experience was not neat. Their knowledge is relational. They count by households, by church pews, by the missing chairs at a table. The city's institutions insist on proof. Proof in this context is a trap. Greenwood has been burned. Documents have been lost. Families have been scattered. People have been detained and controlled. The survivors are asked to produce evidence in the very form that fire and displacement were designed to erase. They are asked for names and dates when the violence itself was indifferent to names, when the bodies were treated as obstacles rather than as citizens. In the official record, the mechanisms for counting death exist: the coroner, the hospitals, the funeral homes, the cemeteries. Yet each mechanism has limits, and those limits are not neutral. Hospitals, in 1921 Tulsa, are not equally accessible. A wounded black person may not be admitted, may not be treated, may not survive long enough to be recorded properly. Funerary practices can be interrupted by fear, by lack of money, by the city's restrictions. A family may not be permitted to reclaim a body quickly. A burial may occur under pressure, without ceremony, without the paperwork that is supposed to accompany it. And there is the simplest fact: death can be hidden, a body can be placed in a truck and moved, a grave can be dug quickly, a burial can be performed without public notice, a name can be misspelled or not recorded at all. A death certificate can list a vague cause, a vague date, a vague location. A ledger can be lost. A file can become incomplete in ways that always seem to benefit the same side. In the days after the massacre, Tulsa is full of noise and yet full of silence. Everyone is speaking. Few are saying what matters. The dead are present in rumor and absence. Survivors talk about mass graves, about bodies buried together, about nighttime burials, about trucks carrying the dead away from Greenwood before families could claim them. These accounts do not function as folklore to them. They function as explanation. If the official numbers are low, then bodies must have been removed from the official system. The city prefers to dismiss such talk as exaggeration, as grief distorted into myth. This dismissal has a familiar tone in American history. When the victims speak, their testimony is treated as unstable. When the institutions speak, their paperwork is treated as truth, even when that paperwork is incomplete. The problem is that the archive itself appears wounded. If the dead were counted properly, the file would be thick with documentation, names, causes, locations, burial permits. Instead, it often reads like a room where someone has hurriedly cleared the table. There are documents, but not enough. There are references to records, but not always the records themselves. There are gaps that cannot be explained by chance alone, not when the event was large, public, and heavily witnessed. For Greenwood families, grief becomes an investigation they are not empowered to conduct. A mother looks for her son and finds only rumors. A wife asks after her husband and receives only vague responses. A pastor tries to account for his congregation and discovers that some members have vanished into the city's shadows. The living begin to recognize that they are being asked to mourn without certainty, and that uncertainty is its own form of cruelty. It prevents closure. It forces the mind to repeat possibilities. It keeps the wound open. In official spaces, death becomes a topic handled with distance. Officials discuss casualties. They talk about reports. They speak of numbers as if numbers are merely data points, not the end of a person's breathing. The language is calm, which is presented as professionalism. But calm can also be an anesthetic. It can dull the moral urgency that death should produce. Meanwhile, survivors carry a different kind of archive. They carry memory. Who was last seen where? Who ran in which direction? Who was heard calling out? Who was dragged away? Who did not show up at the camp roll calls? They carry the knowledge of intimate routines disrupted. The barber who never reopened his shop, the teacher who never returned to class, the father who never came back for his children. This archive does not come with signatures or seals. It comes with voices and trembling and silence. It is harder to cite, therefore easier to dismiss. But it persists. The contested death toll becomes a battleground because it determines the scale of the city's responsibility. If the number is small, the event can be framed as a tragedy without culprits. If the number is large, the event begins to resemble what it was: a mass assault on a black community in broad daylight, enabled by armed groups and institutional failure. The city has incentives to keep the number small. Insurance claims, public reputation, political stability, and legal exposure all sit behind the count like invisible hands on a scale. The survivors have incentives to insist on the larger truth, not for drama, but for dignity. A minimized count is a second erasure. It makes the dead disappear again, this time into a statistic designed to keep the city comfortable. In the long aftermath, the question of the dead refuses to settle. It returns with each anniversary, each new inquiry, each discovery of a forgotten document, each attempt to locate burial sites. It becomes one of the massacre's most enduring features, not only that people were killed, but that the city could not, or would not, say how many. And so the counting becomes part of the violence. Because a community is not only destroyed by fire and bullets, It is also destroyed by what cannot be proven afterward. If the dead are not properly recorded, their absence can be treated as unconfirmed. Their families can be told they are mistaken. Their grief can be made to look like exaggeration. The city can proceed as if the loss was unfortunate but limited, and therefore forgettable. In Greenwood, forgetting is not an option. The missing are woven into the district's rebuilt identity, into the way people speak softly when they mention certain streets, into the way elders pause before naming those who did not return. The silence is not ignorance. It is respect mixed with rage. The official version would like the massacre to have a beginning and an end, an incident, a disturbance, a restoration. But the dead do not offer neat endings. They offer an open file, one that cannot be closed by declaring the count. Because even if a number is agreed upon, the moral question remains unchanged, cold, and direct. In a city that could print headlines, issue badges, organize detention camps, and rebuild downtown confidence, why was it so difficult to record and honor the names of the black citizens who were killed? Or more precisely, was it difficult at all, or was it simply inconvenient? Part 8. Blame on paper. Courts, insurance, and the riot that voids responsibility. After the smoke, Greenwood is forced into a second landscape, one made of desks and stamps, of polite denials, of official terms chosen with care. The first destruction was physical, the second is legal. In the days following June 1st, Tulsa's institutions begin to behave as if the primary danger is not what happened, but what might be demanded because it happened. The city's language shifts from emergency to liability. It begins to secure itself not with rifles, but with definitions. The most important definition is a single word: riot. In public conversation, it sounds almost descriptive: chaos, disorder, fighting. But in the machinery of law and insurance, riot is not merely a label. It is a device. It is the key that can lock a claim, void a policy, redirect blame. It allows an event with perpetrators to be reframed as an event without authors. If Greenwood was destroyed by a riot, then nobody destroyed it. Greenwood destroyed itself, or it was destroyed by the natural force of crowd behavior. The city becomes a victim of disorder rather than an agent that permitted or participated in violence. The narrative becomes symmetrical. Both sides clashed, therefore both sides share responsibility. This symmetry is not an accident. It is an outcome that benefits power. In Greenwood, survivors begin to inventory losses with a discipline that feels almost impossible after catastrophe. They list addresses that no longer exist. They calculate the value of furniture, stock, tools, cash kept in drawers, clothing, jewelry, pianos, books, medical equipment, barber's chairs, hotel linens, cash registers. They do this not because lists will restore anything, but because they understand what the law respects: documentation. The language of grief is not admissible in court. The language of smoke is not admissible. Only a list, typed or handwritten, becomes a form of speech that institutions will hear. But even this speech is constrained by what survived. Deeds were burned, receipts were burned, business ledgers were burned. Some people can only reconstruct their losses from memory. Memory, in a courtroom, is treated as fragile. The same system that treated rumor as enough to ignite the city now treats survivors' recollection as insufficient to prove harm. They file insurance claims. Here, the second destruction begins in earnest. Many policies contain exclusions for damage caused by riots or civil unrest. These exclusions are written in small print long before any specific disaster. They exist to protect insurers from the costs of social instability. In the abstract, they are business instruments. In Greenwood's reality, they become weapons, a clause that transforms deliberate destruction into unrecoverable loss. Survivors are told in formal letters and office conversations that the damage is not covered. The tone is often calm, procedural, almost sympathetic. That calm is part of the violence. It turns the refusal into something that feels inevitable, like weather. It removes the moral dimension. It suggests that the denial is not a choice, but a rule. Yet the rule relies on the label, and the label relies on the city's willingness to define the event as a riot. This is why the archive of blame becomes so carefully constructed. Newspapers repeat the term, officials use it in statements, reports adopt it. The term begins to harden into the official truth. Once it hardens, it becomes difficult to challenge because challenging it requires institutions to accuse themselves. Some survivors attempt to fight through the courts. They seek recovery for property loss. They seek recognition. They seek accountability for theft and arson. But the courthouse, which Greenwood approached on May 31st to prevent lawless execution, now becomes the place where the law's limitations are exposed in a different way. The system is not designed to adjudicate crimes when the perpetrators are numerous, socially protected and, at times, intertwined with official authority. Legal claims require defendants. Defendants require identification. Identification requires investigation. Investigation requires a willingness to confront the white men who participated in the violence and the officials who empowered them. That willingness is rare. Instead, the system drifts toward abstractions. It discusses conditions. It discusses unrest. It discusses regrettable outcomes. These phrases perform the same function as the word riot. They spread responsibility thin until it evaporates. Meanwhile, the city begins to consider what to do with the land itself. Greenwood's destruction opens an opportunity that is never spoken in blunt terms but appears in proposals and planning language: redevelopment. If Greenwood's businesses are gone and its residents are displaced, then the city can imagine reshaping the district under the banner of modernization or public safety. The same city that failed to protect Greenwood now positions itself as the authority that can decide Greenwood's future. There are discussions about zoning, about fire ordinances, about building requirements that, on paper, sound reasonable. Safer construction, improved infrastructure, a better city. But in context, these measures function differently. They can be used to prevent Greenwood from rebuilding quickly, to raise costs beyond what survivors can afford, to push the Black District outward or break it apart. Technical requirements become moral instruments. They allow the city to claim it is merely enforcing standards while effectively controlling who can return and what can be rebuilt. Survivors recognize this pattern even when it is not explicitly stated. They hear public safety and understand it might mean exclusion. They hear fire code and understand it might mean delay. They hear replanning and understand it might mean erasure under a new name. The courts, too, become arenas of narrative rather than of truth. When survivors testify or submit claims, they must speak in a language the system respects: dates, addresses, property values, precise descriptions. But they also face an implicit accusation that their very effort to claim damages is disruptive. The city's comfort depends on closure. Claimants prevent closure. Claimants keep the file open. Therefore, claimants can be treated as troublemakers, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. The psychological tension of this stage is cold and relentless. The survivors are required to prove what everyone saw. Thousands saw Greenwood burning. Thousands knew the district was attacked. Yet survivors must behave as if the event were uncertain and must be established through careful documentation. The burden of proof falls on those who lost everything, while those who participated in destruction are insulated by the same social fabric that made their violence possible. And the word riot sits at the center of the file like a seal. It does more than deny insurance. It shapes how the event will be remembered, taught, and litigated. A riot implies disorder that erupted. It implies the city was caught off guard. It implies an unfortunate mutuality. It implies no single moral direction. But Greenwood's lived reality, preserved in testimony and in the stubborn clarity of survivors' descriptions, insists on direction. Armed white groups moved into a black district. Black residents were disarmed, detained, chased, and burned out. The city imposed control after destruction rather than before it. Then the city used administrative language to deny responsibility. In official documents, this direction is blurred, as if the file itself is trying to look away. The assault on Greenwood becomes, in paperwork, an incident. The community becomes a problem area. Reconstruction becomes a challenge. Loss becomes unfortunate. Each euphemism removes a layer of accountability, and yet, even in the official record, traces of the truth remain, because paper cannot entirely conceal what happened. There are lists of destroyed buildings. There are maps of what no longer exists. There are records of detention sites filled with black citizens. There are letters describing claims. There are signatures that authorize actions. The file may be incomplete, but it is not empty. The city can minimize, but it cannot erase completely. For survivors, the legal struggle is exhausting because it demands a particular kind of discipline: to speak calmly about catastrophe, to translate trauma into categories, to compress the destruction of a life into a line item. It demands that a person describe the burning of a home as property damage, as if the home were merely lumber and not the physical container of memory. This is how the second violence works. It does not use fire. It uses classification. When a claim is denied, the survivor loses twice. First the thing itself, then the institutional acknowledgement that the thing was wrongfully taken. Denial tells the survivor, in effect, that the loss is real but not legitimate as an injustice. The city can then move forward with a clean ledger, as if the disaster is simply part of history's roughness rather than a moral event. Yet Greenwood does not disappear. Even at this stage, even in this cold legal landscape, people begin to rebuild in the gaps where the law does not offer help. They borrow money. They share tools. They sleep in tents. They draft new deeds. They write new receipts. They create new records because they understand that the archive is not only a memory, it is a shield. The official version wants a file closed with the word riot. The survivors know the file cannot be closed by a word. It can only be closed by justice. And justice in Tulsa is being negotiated not in a courtroom's pursuit of truth, but in the careful selection of terms that protect those who hold power. What remains at the end of this part of the story is a city that burned a district and then used paper to argue that the district's ashes were nobody's fault. And for Greenwood, the question becomes sharper and more personal. How do you rebuild when the law that should protect your property is also the law that refuses to recognize the crime? Part 9. Rebuilding under pressure. Greenwood returns, but the file stays open. The first thing Greenwood rebuilds is not a building, it is a decision. After June 1921, the district is no longer a neighborhood in the ordinary sense. It is a field of foundations, scorched streets, and half-standing chimneys that look like thin gravestones for rooms that once held laughter, arguments, meals, and sleep. The air is different, not only because of smoke and ash, but because every surviving resident has learned, in a concentrated way, what the city is capable of. The question is not merely whether they can rebuild. The question is whether rebuilding is safe. The official mood of Tulsa, once immediate violence subsides, leans toward moving on. The city prefers closure. It prefers a narrative where the event was an episode, bad, regrettable, but concluded, rather than an indictment of civic structure. It wants its downtown to continue shining. It wants oil money to continue flowing. It wants investors to believe in stability. Greenwood survivors want something simpler, to live. And yet living in this context requires a confrontation with the same institutions that failed them. They must go back to offices to request permits, to register deeds, to secure materials, to petition for services. They must stand again at counters where clerks decide how quickly a file is processed. They must speak to officials whose authority was already proven unreliable. They must act as if the system is neutral, because refusing to engage with the system would mean accepting permanent displacement. So they return. Some return first in tents. The district fills with canvas and makeshift shelters, temporary structures that become semi-permanent because waiting for assistance is futile and waiting for justice is endless. Families sleep on the land where their homes stood, not out of sentiment alone, but because land is leverage. If they leave, others may claim it. If they leave, the city may redesign the district without them. Occupying the ground becomes a form of resistance performed quietly, day after day, in plain sight. The official version of these tent cities can be framed as charity and hardship, as evidence of relief efforts and the city's eventual kindness. But in the lived reality, the tents are also a statement. We are still here. You did not erase us. Rebuilding is not uniform. It happens in pulses. A barber finds enough tools to reopen in a small wooden structure, not elegant but functional. A grocery store restarts with limited stock and a stubborn sense of normalcy. Churches reconstruct first because churches are infrastructure. They gather people, coordinate aid, preserve collective memory. Schools return as soon as they can because education is one of the few assets violence cannot easily confiscate, and because parents understand that a child without routine is a child who carries disaster in their body for longer than necessary. But every act of reconstruction is shadowed by pressure. There are discussions, formal and informal, about moving Greenwood elsewhere, about preventing rebuilding in certain areas, about imposing requirements that function as obstacles. The language is always respectable: fire safety, urban improvement, planning. Yet the timing makes these measures difficult to read as neutral. When a district has just been burned, raising barriers to rebuilding does not simply improve safety. It controls who can return and at what cost. Survivors learn that the city can destroy a neighborhood in a day, and then take years debating whether that neighborhood should be allowed to exist in the same place again. In this period, paper becomes both weapon and shield. Property claims are contested. Some deeds have been lost in the fire. Some titles are unclear. Some opportunists attempt to take advantage of confusion. A family that has lived on a parcel for years may now be asked to prove it with documents that burned in their own home. A business owner may need to reconstruct ownership through secondary records, through recollection, through whatever scraps remain. Every signature matters. Every stamp matters. Every delayed filing is a vulnerability. The archive is not a passive record, it is an arena, and the city's official narrative continues to influence what the archive can hold. If the event is defined as a riot, then Greenwood's losses remain framed as the product of disorder rather than the result of targeted destruction. That framing affects how clerks treat claims, how officials speak in hearings, how newspapers describe the rebuilding. It creates a moral fatigue in the wider public. Riots happen, people rebuild, the city moves on. The story becomes procedural. For survivors, nothing is procedural. Everything is intimate. A man rebuilding a wall does not simply rebuild a wall. He rebuilds a boundary between his family and the world that came for them. A woman reopening a business does not simply reopen for profit. She reopens to refuse the city's attempt to define her as a victim without agency. Each nail driven into new lumber carries a quiet, stubborn argument. You cannot make us disappear without our consent. But the psychological cost is heavy, and it accumulates. In Greenwood, people live with the knowledge that the attackers were not strangers from another place. They were Tulsans. They were men who worked in the city, who shopped in the same markets, who might pass on the sidewalk in daylight. Some survivors can identify individuals. Others recognize voices or gestures. The familiarity is a particular kind of horror. The violence was not an invasion by outsiders alone. It was a civic act performed by neighbors under the cover of hierarchy. That means rebuilding is not only material. It is also a daily confrontation with unreconciled fear. Children grow up with the massacre as a presence they did not choose. Some witnessed fire directly. Others absorbed it through the hush in adults' voices, through the abrupt way conversations stop when certain streets are mentioned, through the way their elders scan crowds with a vigilance that never fully relaxes. Trauma is transmitted not only through storytelling, but through silence, through posture, through the learned habit of watching doors. Adults, too, carry their own forms of silence. They speak of the event carefully because the city is still the city. The power structure remains. The newspapers that inflamed the crowd still publish. The lawmen who failed to protect still wear badges. The courts that offered little accountability still stand. Speaking openly can feel like reopening danger, especially when perpetrators have not been punished and may still be nearby. So rebuilding occurs under a ceiling of caution. And yet, Greenwood does rebuild. Not fully, not quickly, not without loss. But it returns with astonishing determination. Businesses reopen, homes rise again, sometimes smaller, sometimes built with what could be afforded. The district reconstitutes its rhythms: church on Sunday, commerce in daylight, music and conversation in the evenings. The official city may interpret this as proof that the system ultimately worked. Look, they rebuilt, therefore the story is one of resilience. Therefore the city can admire without apologizing. Resilience becomes a narrative that allows spectators to feel uplifted without feeling responsible. For Greenwood, resilience is not a moral decoration, it is necessity. But even as buildings rise, another structure remains absent: justice. No broad legal reckoning occurs that matches the scale of the destruction. There is no clean sequence of trials that names perpetrators and assigns penalties. There is no sweeping restitution. There is no official record that fully admits coordinated attack and official complicity. Instead, there are partial acknowledgments, quiet evasions, and a civic drift toward forgetting. This drift is not passive. Forgetting is maintained. It is maintained in school lessons that omit details. It is maintained in public commemorations that avoid culpability. It is maintained in the careful use of language: riot, disturbance, tragedy, that softens intent. It is maintained in the absence of prosecutions that would force the city to speak plainly about who did what. Greenwood, rebuilding amid this maintained forgetting, becomes a place where the physical landscape and the moral landscape are misaligned. New buildings stand on old ash. New families occupy streets where violence once moved freely. Life resumes, but it resumes under a layer of unresolved history, like a floor built over a cellar that still contains smoke. In the years that follow, some survivors leave. They cannot bear the proximity. Others stay because leaving feels like surrender. Some are forced out by economic pressure, by the difficulty of reclaiming wealth without insurance and without compensation. Some stay and prosper again, but the prosperity is different now, shadowed by memory, tightened by caution, shaped by the knowledge that success can attract hostility. Greenwood returns, but not as it was, and the case file remains open, not in any courthouse, but in the lived contradiction of the city itself, a place that can celebrate growth while refusing to adjudicate its own violence, a place that can rebuild roads and buildings while leaving moral rubble untouched. By the end of this phase, Greenwood stands again as an American city within a city. But now the boundary is not only segregation, it is also memory. Official Tulsa wants a narrative with an end. Greenwood lives in a narrative with an echo. The district's rebuilt streets are not merely streets. They are evidence that the city's attempt at erasure failed, yet they are also evidence that the city's attempt at accountability failed as well. Every rebuilt storefront is both triumph and question. Every reopened church is both sanctuary and archive. Every new deed filed is both a claim to land and a reminder that paper can be burned and then demanded again. Greenwood's return does not close the file. It proves only this, that a community can survive what a system tries to do to it, but survival is not the same as justice, and rebuilding is not the same as recognition. The story, therefore, does not end with construction. It continues with the long, quiet pressure of a past that remains legally unresolved, socially minimized, and psychologically present, waiting, year after year, for a city to decide whether it will finally read its own archive honestly. Part 10. The Long Reckoning. Silence, commissions, and the present tense. A city can destroy a district in a day, then spend a century debating what to call the destruction. For decades after 1921, Tulsa carries Greenwood like a hidden wound. The scar is visible in geography and the unevenness of investment, in the way certain streets do not recover their former density. But the story itself is treated as dangerous material, too accusatory, too destabilizing, too capable of provoking questions that the city is not ready to answer. Silence becomes a policy, without needing to be written down. In official spaces, the massacre is rarely spoken of plainly. The word riot persists because it is convenient. It turns perpetrators into weather. It turns civic failure into misfortune. It allows a city to say, in effect, that history happened to it rather than through it. In Greenwood households, memory does not disappear, it adapts. Survivors learn what can be said publicly and what must be kept inside the family. They tell some children the truth directly, and they protect others with partial stories, not because they want forgetting, but because they fear what truth can cost in a town that never fully punished the men who burned it. A parent's silence is not always denial. It can be a strategy of protection, but protection has a price. When a generation grows up without the full story, the city's official version has room to harden. The archive follows this pattern. It is not empty, but it is fractured. Photographs exist, but their captions are careful. Newspaper clippings exist, but their language is evasive. Court documents exist, but they tend to narrow the event into technicalities. Property records show what was lost and later rebuilt, but they do not record terror. A ledger can list a building's value, but it cannot list the sound of a mother trying to keep her children quiet while armed men move past the window. Time passes. Tulsa expands. Oil gives way to other forms of capital. The city develops new reasons to present itself as modern, orderly, attractive. Greenwood's story becomes something that does not fit the brochure, so it is kept out of schools, out of tourist narratives, out of official commemorations. It survives in churches, in private recollections, in community memory that is often treated as anecdotal by those who prefer paperwork. And then slowly, the silence begins to fail. It does not fail because institutions suddenly become honest. It fails because survivors age, and aging adds urgency to testimony. It fails because descendants insist on more than respect. They insist on acknowledgement. It fails because historians, journalists, and community advocates keep finding documents that do not align with the comfortable story. It fails because the physical world itself, foundations, burial grounds, patterns of loss, continues to contradict denial. The city is eventually forced to reopen the file. The reopening arrives not as a single moment, but as a series of reluctant steps. Public discussions, renewed research, formal inquiries. The language remains cautious because caution is how institutions protect themselves. Terms are negotiated. Massacre begins to appear more often than riot. The shift is not merely semantic, it is moral. The word massacre implies victims. It implies perpetrators. It implies responsibility. But responsibility is where the file becomes contested again. When commissions and reports are produced, they bring an official structure to what survivors have long known. They assemble timelines, they collect testimony, they analyze property loss, they acknowledge failures of law enforcement, they concede, sometimes explicitly, that the violence was organized and that the aftermath was managed in ways that harmed survivors further. These findings give the city an opportunity to do what it refused in 1921, to state clearly what happened. Yet even these official acts carry limits. Reports can be thorough and still be politically constrained. Recommendations can be offered and still not be enacted. A city can admit wrongdoing in principle and still avoid the consequences of that admission in practice. The survivor's reality remains the baseline against which all official language is tested. In recorded testimonies, their voices carry a particular weight, calm, often restrained, sometimes trembling, always precise in the way someone becomes precise when their truth has been questioned for too long. They speak of being marched at gunpoint. They speak of homes burning. They speak of bodies. They speak of detentions that felt like imprisonment. They speak of the humiliation of needing a white employer to vouch for their movement, as if freedom were something to be signed out. These testimonies do something the earlier archive struggled to do. They insist that the story is not only about buildings, it is about what the system did to human beings. Then the ground itself begins to speak in a different way. The question of burial sites, long present in survivor accounts, returns with institutional attention. Investigations are proposed, searches are conducted. The city looks, sometimes publicly, sometimes cautiously, for evidence that bodies were buried hurriedly, without ceremony, without proper record. The prospect of mass graves changes the tone. It is one thing to debate terminology in a conference room. It is another to confront the possibility that the dead were handled in ways designed to prevent counting. Even the act of searching becomes a moral statement, an acknowledgement that the archive may have been intentionally incomplete. Yet the modern city also learns that reopening the file does not guarantee closure. It creates new friction. There are legal questions. What remedies remain possible after so much time? There are political questions. What does restitution mean, and who decides? There are psychological questions. What does acknowledgement do when the people who lived through the event are gone? There are civic questions. Can a city carry an admission of atrocity without collapsing into defensiveness? For Greenwood descendants, the tension is sharper. They do not experience the massacre as abstract history. They experience it as inherited loss. Wealth stolen and never returned, opportunity burned and never compensated, trauma passed down in patterns of caution and distrust. They watch the city celebrate growth, while their families remember how quickly growth was used as a reason to erase them. They hear public apologies and ask what an apology is worth without material repair. The official version, in its most polished form, often tries to split the difference. It wants to honor victims without fully confronting perpetrators. It wants to remember without paying. It wants to teach history without allowing history to dictate present obligations. This is the classic institutional compromise, recognition without consequence. But the massacre resists compromise because it was not a compromise event. It was an event of domination, enabled by systems that still leave traces in the present, inequities in wealth, in policing, in education, in who is believed and who must prove their pain. As Tulsa enters the 21st century, Greenwood becomes both a place and an argument. It is invoked in debates about racial justice, about reparations, about historical memory, about what the law does when it serves power rather than people. The massacre's archive expands with new scholarship, new digitization, new public discussion. Yet the old archive, missing pages, minimized counts, evasive labels, still exerts its influence. The city is not only fighting over what happened, it is fighting over what it must do because it happened. And then the story arrives at its most difficult point, the present tense. Because the present is where the file stops being historical and becomes ethical. The questions are no longer about 1921 alone. They are about how a society responds when the horror was systemic, when the perpetrators were ordinary citizens and deputized men, when the law failed, when the victims were detained afterward, when restitution was denied through definitions and clauses. In this sense, Greenwood is not only a tragedy, it is a diagnostic test. It reveals what institutions do when confronted with their own complicity. They delay, they reframe, they soften language, they offer partial acknowledgments, they commission reports, they hold ceremonies, they build memorials, and they hope that time will finish what denial began. But time does not erase a file. It only changes who is left to read it. In the end, the story does not conclude with a verdict, because the verdict was never issued in the proper place. It concludes, instead, with a quiet awareness that thousands of lives were displaced, a community's wealth was burned, and the city's official memory spent decades attempting to treat the event as an unfortunate disturbance rather than a deliberate assault. So the final reflection is not a speech, it is a pause. A district once bright with commerce, now remembered in photographs and in rebuilt streets. Names that were not properly recorded, now spoken carefully by descendants. A courthouse that once stood as the symbol of law, now standing as the symbol of what law failed to prevent. And a question that remains open, because it is not only Tulsa's question, and it is not only 1921's question. When a system can destroy a community and then protect itself with paperwork, what does justice mean when the paperwork is finally read aloud? It's finally read aloud. 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 It's finally read aloud.